This week on NCTV, we continue our look into the history of U.S. presidents. This week, we learn about America's 17th president, the third and final president from Tennessee, President Andrew Johnson.
It's interesting because Andrew Johnson is not usually on the list of the 10 best presidents in American history. He's usually at the bottom of the list, the worst presidents, not the very worst, as we'll see. But he's not highly acclaimed, but he was actually a very strong individual, a very capable person. To start off with, he was born in North Carolina in a log cabin. His father died when Andrew was only 3 years old, and his father died after having a heart attack after he'd rescued 3 men from drowning. So, you know, that's interesting. This is a thing you never hear of. His mother was then forced to make a living on her own. They were very poor, and she was a washerwoman. And the article I read emphasized the fact that this was not a high-class profession. You know why? This is silly. Because a washerwoman went to other people's houses unescorted by a man to collect their laundry, and sometimes went in and out without an escort, and it was considered a trashy way to make a living. And washerwomen were usually black slave women or poor white women. And so she was a washerwoman, but she doesn't remarry, and she and her stepfather, his stepfather, put him out to, what's the word, apprenticeship, to a tailor. And of course, you know, he's famous for being a tailor. He was 10 years old, his brother was 14. And so they become an apprentice. Now, what's interesting about that, it says one of two things. Either she wanted her sons to have a career, a profession, because she was a washerwoman, and they didn't have a farm, they were very poor, or it was lucrative in that she and the stepfather got money for that. You know, they were paid for that. So I'm not sure what her motives were. They could have been noble or they could not have been. Now, they didn't like being the apprenticeship. They didn't like it, and so both boys ran away, and they put out a reward for them. Now, this is another indication of his character. The reward for them was like $10 or whatever, a lot of money back then. But the way the reward was offered, it said, if only one person is brought back and it is the younger child, they still get the full reward. As if to say, well, you can just forget the older, his older brother wasn't good. I want that kid back. So, but no one turns him in, but he's scared he'll get arrested. So he comes back to town. And then the family themselves moved to Tennessee, again, to avoid authorities because they'd broken the contract. And of course, they're very poor, and so at 17, he opens up his own tailor shop in the front yard, his little building in the front yard of his parents' house. And I've been to Greenville, and I think they have that either reconstructed or the original tailor shop is still there. But he was very good. Now, up to this time, he did not know how to read and write. Now, he's bound to have gotten some bit of education, because when you're around people, you learn a few things, you know. And back then, if you had a large tailor shop, you would have someone come in and read while your people were sewing, just kind of keep them being bored. They didn't have radio back then. And they think that he already had a desire to learn, because in later life, he was a voracious reader. He loved to read. And they think it was inspired perhaps by having these people read to him, but he couldn't read himself. So he meets a young lady a year younger than him, and she teaches him to read and write. And of course, within a year, they're engaged and they get married. And she was Eliza McCardle, and she was very smart, of course, very capable. And she, as his wife, was very helpful to his career. She was a big plus for him. So she talks him into, she instructs him on how to invest the money he makes from his tailor, because he's a good tailor. He would brag all of his life about the quality of his tailor work. And so he starts investing money, and pretty soon they're moderately wealthy because they invest in real estate. You know, that's the quick way to make money back then as now. So the marriage, this is what's interesting, the marriage was performed by a man named Mordecai Lincoln, who was a first cousin to Tom Lincoln, who was the father of Abraham Lincoln. And that's interesting because the two men would then go on and serve together, and one will make the top list and one will make the bottom list. He becomes active in local politics, first as a city commissioner, councilman, different counties, towns call him different things, and then as mayor of Greenville. Then he's successful with that. He runs for the Tennessee State House of Representatives, is elected. It is said that he was a very good speaker, public speaker, and that if you had the information in front of him, he could persuade you to do anything, that he was very effective as that. And we talked about stump speakers with, you know, Andrew Jackson and James K. Polk. Good politicians back then, their speaking was what made them get elected. If they were good at that could, didn't matter what else they did, if they were a good speaker. So then, in the House of Representatives for Tennessee, he was a Jackson Democrat, a good friend of Andrew Jackson. And the House, Jackson Democrats were considered people for the little guy. He was very big for the little guy, which brought me to the question of how tall was Andrew Johnson? Because if you thought of Andrew Johnson, would you think of him as short? Pictures of him show him wearing a long coat, and they make him look short, but actually he's 5'11", which is pretty tall for that time, 5'11". So he wasn't as short as I thought he was. So in 1853, he's elected governor of Tennessee, and he was a decent governor. He served 2 terms, and then runs for the United States Senator from Tennessee, and gets elected right at the outbreak of the Civil War. Now, he was against secession. His own history of slavery is kind of convoluted. We're not sure. At the most, he owned 10 slaves at one time. And our evidence is that he was very good to his slaves. And he does actually free his slaves before Abraham Lincoln frees all of them, but just a little bit before that. he probably knew it was coming. But nonetheless, he did have slaves. And he was against secession. Now, remember, he's just been elected the United States Senator from Tennessee. When the war breaks out, every other Southern senator returns home. He stayed in Washington. Now, that was controversial. In the North, he was considered a hero because he stuck with the Union. But in the South, he was a traitor, and that's interesting. So they hated him for a while. Then he's a good senator, of course, but he's representing a state that doesn't like him. Now, Tennessee, is quickly taken over by Union forces. And so by 1862, most of the state, half the state, was already in Union hands. And East Tennessee, where he was from, was strongly Union. So actually his thinkings were not unusual. They just didn't agree with most of the state, but in East Tennessee, he was all right. We've got to remember that during the Civil War, 100,000 men from Tennessee served in the Confederacy, the largest of any state. But at the same time, 50,000 men from Tennessee served in Union, most from East Tennessee. And that was more than some Union states. So see, Tennessee was actually kind of divided. So he actually represented well the people that more or less that he represented all this time. So President Lincoln then, as Tennessee is taken over, makes him the military governor of Tennessee, which again, popular, unpopular, depending on which side part of the state you're from. Of course, what really happens is when Lincoln runs again in 1864 for his second term, he names Johnson to his ticket as vice president. And he did that for several reasons. One, he had a good working relationship with Johnson. Secondly, Johnson had done a decent job as military governor, but also because he wanted to show the South that he was using a Southerner. He was trying to to involve the South. Look, I don't hate you guys. I've got a Southerner on my ticket. And of course, he is elected, and then Lincoln's assassinated. So he becomes president. Now, that's when it all goes downhill. He was very sympathetic to the South. He had mixed feelings about how the South should be treated after the end of the war. In particular, he didn't believe, unfortunately, that black people were ready for voting, that they weren't prepared to handle voting. Now, I'm not sure whether it's because he thought they weren't capable of voting or maybe they just weren't prepared for voting, but he knew. And so he fought that issue. And he also, when Congress was out on recess, he passed presidential edicts that would allow Confederates to, former Confederates to vote, retain their vote, if they take the oath of allegiance. And most Union states didn't want that. They wanted to keep white former soldiers from voting until blacks had gotten in there and been able to make a name for themselves. So this quickly undermined all of that. So now, all of a sudden, he's a hero in the South and a demon in the North. All right? It's a complete reversal. Then, while he was president, the Congress passes 2 big laws. One, the 14th Amendment, that no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And Johnson was against it, but he had no control over it. It was passed. Then the Civil Rights Law was passed, giving all Americans equal rights under the law. Johnson vetoed it, but Congress overrode his veto. The very first time a major piece of legislation by any American president was overridden by veto. So again, a strike against him. So he has no opportunity to be reelected already. But they're so mad at him that they look for a chance to make it worse, and they impeach him. Now, the impeachment is kind of a trumped-up charge. He fired Secretary of War Stanton. And Secretary of War Stanton was already notorious for being hard to get along with. And there is a law called the Act of Tenure Office, if you're in office. They were kind of stretching that law to impeach him. But they did impeach him. Now remember, impeaching does not mean you're guilty. That's just the act of charging you with not doing your job. So he is impeached, but the actual impeachment vote did not pass by one vote. By one vote. He came that close to being actually the whole process. So, but they don't ask him to run again. There's no chance to run again. So he comes back to Tennessee, and after a few years, runs for office again. Runs to become United States Senator, a position he previously held. He's elected. The first and only time an American president has been president and then run for Senate and been elected. However, he's getting old and his health is not good. It was a hard race, and again, it's interesting because remember again, the people in Tennessee had been against him, you know, and then all of a sudden they're for him again. It's considered a great political comeback, but he wasn't in office very long before he died of a stroke, that kind of process, 66 years old. What I find particularly interesting about him, his wife died the same year, and when he was buried, he was wrapped in the United States flag, and a copy of the Constitution was placed under his head. So, you know, he had a hard road, but he was a good person, good person. Yeah. Unfortunately, that hangs over him. His not working with the Congress and not working with equal rights for black people helped usher in the Jim Crow laws and that kind of thing. So consequently, on the list of the worst presidents, he's almost always in the last five. Just not an effective president. I don't think he had any major legislation passed that he himself, you know, wanted passed that he was able to push. But he's not always the bottom. He's rarely the bottom. That's for James Buchanan. He almost always gets the bottom.
Next week, we'll learn about America's 18th president, President Ulysses S. Grant. Reporting from Hartsville, Barry Hyatt, NCTV.